trained for over 30 years. Thank you. I've had collies since I've been in middle school, so I'm very passionate about the breed. And I've also been active in participating in Pennhip, which we'll get into, for probably over 20 years now. I think it adds to our ability to diagnose hip dysplasia quite a bit. But a couple points I want to make before we get started. My talk is primarily on hip dysplasia and briefly on elbow dysplasia. I think an important point to make is that we are on this together. None of our collies live in a vacuum. No single collie created a disease, including hip dysplasia. Lately, I've heard a lot, everything from there's a hip dysplasia epidemic to an outbreak. Well, nothing is further from the truth. Hip dysplasia has always existed at a relatively low level in our breed. The problem is a lot of times we weren't looking for it, so we didn't find it. And I love to quote Dr. Leanne Clark, who spoke last year, that every dog has a mother and father, and they both contribute. So please, let's stop blaming a stud dog, a bitch, a grandfather, an uncle. We're all in this together. Each dog contributes genes. The best we can do is use the test available to us currently, and that is for every disease out there. But as far as hip and elbow dysplasia goes, it does exist in collies. It's not as horrible as some other breeds, but it does exist. And it's pretty obvious why we need good hips. I do a lot of performance. I want to make sure my dogs suffer no pain. We want happy dogs. We want happy owners. We also want healthy elbows. Elbow dysplasia, who's heard of elbow dysplasia in a collie before? Anybody? It's not terribly common. I mean, I think in 30 years I've seen it on both hands full. Certainly not common, but it does exist in collies. So let's look at what's currently available in elbow dysplasia and hip dysplasia. As far as elbow dysplasia, we'll do that first. Unfortunately, the only certification process right now is OFA. It's a simple x-ray that has 4 possible grades. We have normal and grade 1, 2, 3, all of which are considered failing grades. In other words, there is elbow dysplasia present. So what we do to determine elbow dysplasia is we do a simple lateral. That's an x-ray on the side. That's the dog's elbows being bent fully. Not uncomfortable, just a simple x-ray. And OFA is looking for osteoarthritis or arthritis. That's simply what they're looking for. If they see it, they're going to fail them. If they don't, it's usually considered normal. However, it does not diagnose the specific disease the dog may have. Elbow dysplasia has many forms, or many causes, I should say. And in collies, the one I've seen is the medial chorioid process. It's a little piece of bone right on the corner of the elbow attached by a growth plate. And something causes that growth plate not to fuse, and you have the little piece get loose. It's like having a pebble in your shoe, in the worst case. The dogs are very uncomfortable. In milder forms, the piece is just a little loose and is mildly irritating to the elbow, creating arthritis later in life. So here's how the elbow x-rays look on the film here. Just a simple flex x-ray. That's what we're offered right now in OFA. So please remember to evaluate all your breeding dogs, dogs intended for performance or anything, because there's a lot we can do to help these dogs out. But now on to the main topic of discussion. We're on to hip dysplasia. And hip dysplasia, I did receive this PowerPoint from Pennhip. I've been doing Pennhips for over 20 years and found them most useful. The reason I started them is that we had a lot of people come into the office and they were doing everything right. They were breeding only passing scores. Maybe not so much in collies, but in other breeds. But they ended up with dysplastic dogs and their frustration was up to here. So I think it's pretty clear that we didn't have a great solution and we wanted to find some better. So this study will talk about what was currently done, the previous x-rays like OFA, and what's also available in Pennhip. It's pretty clear that canine hip dysplasia is very common, very prevalent in dogs, and many dogs suffer from it. It's basically a welfare issue. These dogs are uncomfortable, and it's really important to keep them comfortable in their life. Briefly to define it, it is from the Latin, meaning faulty development from the hips. It was clearly defined in 1966 by Dr. Olsen from Sweden, who was the first to discover that there was a loose hip joint, which created laxity and subluxation, meaning the hip came out of the socket. This led to progression of arthritis and pain down the road. In 2010, there was a lot of discovery that hip laxity and the environment can affect the severity of the disease, and we'll get more into that later. Simple facts about canine hip dysplasia: it's the most common heritable orthopedic condition. It's degenerative. It gets worse over time. There's no cure. It happens because they were predisposed and developed this. All breeds are affected. The genetics are complicated, likely multiple genes with a definite environmental factors. That is in our dogs predisposed. The environment can affect the severity of the disease, primarily the dog's weight and some of the diet. The environmental influences were discovered by breeders like a lot of things years ago. Labrador breeders came about and said, you know, I know how to make my OFA scores better. I'm going to, and it worked, make her OFAs look better. I starve the dog and I stick it in a crate for the first year of its life. Wow. Guess what? Those OFA x-rays look great. Well, you'll see later why that is. We didn't change the genetics of the dog, but we certainly changed the expression, what we saw in the x-ray. They did eventually get arthritis later in life, but it was much less severe. So a little anatomy here. This is the head of the, I don't have a pointer here, but we have on the left a nice normal hip. There's shiny, glistening cartilage, nice and healthy. But over time with arthritis, we degrade that cartilage. It breaks down and you get bone on bone. You hear people all the time about bone on bone, very painful. And it develops a thickened joint capsule, irregular bone, bone on bone. The dogs are uncomfortable. So let's do a little anatomy here. This is an example of hip laxity. We see the normal hips on the left. The hip joint is ball and socket. The pelvis is the socket. The acetabulum is the socket where the ball of the femur fits in. We're going to use acetabulum a lot. We're going to use ball of the femur. And the neck is the piece that connects it to the femur. These are all critical in looking at when we determine on an x-ray if a dog has arthritis, laxity, and so forth. There's been no argument over time that laxity is what leads to hip dysplasia. It's like having a loose hip rattling around in the joint, putting pressure on the bone. And as you can see, the dog on the right at the top is 6-month-old. Can you all see that the hips are no longer in the joints? That's laxity, quite visible. And these views are on what we call the simple hip extended view. That's like a dog standing up like a person. Probably not the most appropriate way to detect hip dysplasia in a dog because they don't stand like that naturally, except for a few dogs, but they don't stand like that naturally. So, but that's been utilized for years, so we can determine laxity in a really loose dog like the top. And what happens over time? The acetabulum, the piece of the pelvis, gets flat. The ball joint starts to look irregular. That's arthritis. And the neck starts to get thickened. As you can see, by 6 years old, the neck is fat. They look like little squares rather than ball and socket. But hip dysplasia has been around forever. It was first described in 1935, but I thought it was interesting. It happens in people, happens in most species, and it was even found in the dogs in the ancient pyramids, buried who knows how long ago. Been around forever. So as far as the diagnosis goes, that's been another challenge. The clinical signs are too variable. Some dogs aren't lame, yet you take an x-ray, they look horrible. Some are very lame when they're young. I had a dog, it was a retriever that won the National Field Trial Champion. Beautiful dog, fit as a fiddle. We were taking her x-rays and found that she was horribly dysplastic, and she just won the national. So we know that perhaps dogs don't always show what their genetics have led them to have. We also try to diagnose it by feeling it, which is palpation. And we also have used x-rays as a convention to diagnosis. OFA has been the standard up to now, but unfortunately we found there's some dogs that are slipping through OFA that still can produce dysplastic puppies, so there hasn't been a gold standard. Briefly on clinical signs, there's two types. There's the severe type. These are the dogs that are lame when they're young. They're usually less than a year. They're lazy, they lay around a lot. They have rear leg lameness. They bunny hop sometimes. They sometimes lose muscle tone. That's the acute form. Those are pretty easy to find. A lot of those, though, can be quite stabilized, but the chronic form is what should terrify all of us, because those are the dogs that their clinical signs are none to mild changes with age. So here's an example of the two forms. Here's the golden retriever. On the left, this dog has the acute form. It's about a year old. It's having symptoms. It has laxity. We used to think this was a dire prognosis, but then we found that this same dog grew older on the right. Seemed painful as a puppy, responded to non-steroidals, could even come off them. At 6 years old, the owner thought it was pretty normal. Maybe it didn't like to go on long runs. Maybe it didn't like to jog, but swayed a little. Looked pretty normal to the owner. That's why clinical signs are so challenging to help us figure out which dogs are truly affected. Feeling the joint, veterinarians do something called the Ortolani sign. We feel for laxity there. Unfortunately, about half the dogs you feel, you can't pick up their laxity, even good orthopedic surgeons. So the tradition has been the conventional hip extended, the dog in standing position on its back on the x-ray table, OFA style view. And OFA has been the convention. It subjectively scores these dogs, as you see on the list on the right. Normal is considered excellent, good, and fair. Then we have borderline, and dysplastic is considered mild, moderate, and severe. They take these x-rays, 3 radiologists review these x-rays, and they come up with a consensus to call your dog what they feel it is. Other systems in Europe, like VBA, they can do this at 1-year-old. Traditionally, OFA likes to wait till they're 2 years old to give them the permanent. And here's some examples of OFA scoring. Dog on the left, can you see the ball and sockets are well seated, well covered? Dog on the middle is mild hip dysplasia. Can you see, especially that left hip, it's kind of subluxated, there's not so much coverage. And then severe hip dysplasia is on the far right, and that dog has a lot of arthritis. The whole femoral head looks like a little block instead of a ball and socket anymore. So these traditional hip extended x-rays are diagnosing hip dysplasia with 2 criteria. That would be subluxation, meaning you're coming out of the joint, which is also called laxity, and also, there's an example, we're coming out of the joint, and then osteoarthritis or arthritis, those changes we see on the x-ray. That's what OFA and these standard x-rays have been able to determine. Here's an example of subluxation. Subjectively, you're going to call it, but you can see the left is tight, the right is loose. That subluxation is the basis of hip dysplasia. The question is, how do we find those dogs that look pretty good? Because those dogs on the left here, you have a 13-year-old mixed breed on the left, that doesn't take Einstein to figure out that dog has bad hip dysplasia. You can't even hardly tell their hips anymore. But the dog on the right creates a real diagnostic challenge. In other words, different people are going to call that different things. So I'm not going to go into all the fancy measurements and these other systems they've done before, but there's great debate on these dogs. The question is, looks pretty good to me. The question is, some of those dogs are having problems. But like I did, Dr. Gail Smith, who started Pennhip, I think he's a genius. He was an engineer first, he became a veterinarian, and then he became an orthopedic surgeon. And he had a German Shepherd client come to him and say, I'm breeding these dogs, they all have passing OFAs, and I'm having hip dysplasia. And she was pulling her hair out. He took this challenge, and being an engineer and an orthopedic surgeon and everything, he started collecting data and what they call the pathomechanics, how the joint hits each other. He did a lot of research and found another way to help measure joint laxity so that we can really judge these dogs and help select better which ones are predisposed to hip dysplasia and not. And why is this important? Obviously, we want to identify dogs at risk and not breed them. But the other thing is, there are some dogs at risk, especially some breeds where you're not going to get perfect hips in it. And there are preventive measures, environmental things we can control, like diet and weight and exercise, that can make these dogs develop much less severe arthritis and live longer, happier lives. But we need a better screening test, and that's what Dr. Smith decided to do. So Current concerns with OFA was it's subjective. It is an opinion, and we'll show you some data on that in a minute. You have to be 2 years old. Might be a little late for you guys deciding to breed your dogs. And it might be a little early on picking up some dogs actually showing their arthritis. The third problem is we as veterinarians aren't required to send in those x-rays. If I see lousy hips, I tell the client, and we don't spend the extra $40 to send them in. And some other data will show is that there's been just slight improvement in the past 40 years by using OFAs alone. Here's an example of how subjective it is. These are charts. These are 3 independent radiologists on the top. And the disclosure is they all did work for Penn when this study was done. So basically, the bottom is OFA scores. The top 3 are independent radiologists, all certified. They have the exact same 65 x-rays given to them. Look at the variation in the score. The top 2 radiologists failed more than twice the amount of dogs as OFA. The radiologist listed as CFR actually works for OFA too and participated in this. I think the bottom line is it's subjective. And that's the big frustrating part is that it is subjective. Look at the guy down at CFR. He didn't give anyone excellent. He doesn't care if your dog ran the Iditarod and he's 10 years old. He's still not giving it an excellent. So other HIPS giving scores like BVA, KC, FCI have similar results when they sent them another 65 x-rays. And that's another neat thing about Dr. Smith is you ask him for some research papers to show this data and he's got them. It's amazing what he's done. So we mentioned about how when does arthritis show? Is 2 years really good enough? Is 1 year good enough? When do we take these x-rays? It's unknown. And this is where we need to learn more. Who's aware of the Purina lifetime study? Has anyone heard about that? A couple people? I can't get into the details of it, but it's fascinating if you look it up. They basically took Labradors, 48 of them, from litters and equally matched into 2 groups. One, they kept thin. Body condition score, 4 out of 5. 5 being like perfect, so 4 was thin. Thinner than what you guys are used to. And the others, they let them get plump like most Labradors, like little sausages. And those are the 2 different groups they have. So they let them grow their life out. And you'll see this on the commercial. Purina says, oh, feed my food and your dogs will live 2 years longer. Have you anyone seen that commercial? And what really happened was the dogs that were thin lived 2 years longer before they had cancer, organ failure, or some of these orthopedic conditions. So that, yes, feeding Purina food or probably any food into a lean body weight is going to make your dogs healthier. But here's an example of a dog that was kept lean. We did the standard OFA extended hip view, and dog was normal at 1 year. Normal at 5 years. Here's 8 years. I'd be really happy if I saw my dog's x-rays at that 8 years. That's really good. But then, by 11 years old, there's some arthritis in the right hip. When you look at the x-ray, the right hip is actually on your left, but that's the dog's right hip. Just mild blockiness to that head. And dog was fortunate enough to be in the skinny group and lived to be 14 years old, and it had arthritis in both hips by the time it was old. And you might say, oh, the dog's old. It has wear and tear. It was supposed to get arthritis because it's old. Well, part of the Purina study, which I can't get into all the details, is that this dog got a false diagnosis of normal at 2 years, even older. But in the Purina study, they also did the Pennhip procedure and the OFAs and let them live their lives out. And they found that the laxity of the joints when determined by Pennhip was the same the entire life, but the expression of arthritis was expressed more due to environment. The thin dogs didn't get arthritis till they were old. The fat dogs expressed it much younger. So there's something to be learned with that. This is a complicated study, and there's certainly a lot more you can read on that. But certainly the prediction that these dogs were going to get arthritis was determined by the Pennhip study, which they later did. So you might say, well, arthritis is based on laxity. You might say, well, I've been using OFA and I've been really happy, and I think in some breeds like ours where it's not as bad as epidemic proportions like other breeds, we've seen that people have tried to improve hips using OFA, and suffice to say that they did a statistical study on Labrador Hip Improvement, and this study went from 1970 to 2005. And they saw a change when they did the scoring from 2 to 1.9. And although that's a slight improvement, at this rate, if you select for dogs that get good and excellent OFAs, you're going to take and try and just breed those good and excellent OFAs. It's going to take you 437 years to get your dogs to excellent. Yeah, it's not quite good enough, unless y'all are going to live that long. So part of the problem is it's hard for us to select the dogs that are passing that maybe shouldn't be passing. The BVA, which is the British system, Dr. Smith looked at 2000 to 07, and once again compared the dogs that passed according to their scale, and predicted improvement in 44 years. So they thought you could get the dog to a better score in 44 years using their system, another 37 years from now. So slow at best. We just don't have enough to pick the right dogs to improve the hips on these dogs. So this is another study on the BVA KC system, and you can see how the red dots show the average score. And we probably made a little progress initially, but now you see the red lines leveling out. We haven't been able to make much progress since then. Dogs are slipping through the system which have hip dysplasia or hip arthritis. So at this point, we're looking at hip dysplasia as a high incident in a lot of dogs. The x-rays are questionable reliability. It's subjective. It's too late for breeders in some cases. Just a lot of efficacy. And the heritability, if who's familiar with that or not, heritability, a perfect test for heritability would have a heritability of 1, meaning it was pure. The heritability for OFA is considered 0.3, which is considered low. So little progress for genetic change. That's the little calculation you can make. So Dr. Smith came along with Pennhip and he said, I need a better system, and he's going to determine laxity. So years ago, we used to have to go to a course and spend 2 days studying it, and his research is meticulous. Now, you can train technicians, you can do online courses as veterinarians, and be certified. That's one disadvantage of Pennhip, is you got to find someone certified. I have 2 vets certified in my practice and 2 technicians. The other value is they keep a database. Every single Pennhip I do must be submitted. And before I forget to mention, a lot of people hear OFA, you're not supposed to do them in heat or whatever. Pennhip study, they've done in heat dogs and not, and it doesn't change it whatsoever. The number is the number whether the dog's in heat or not. So, a little bit about the Pennhip procedure. Anybody heard of Pennhip here so far? Or? Oh, good. It was purchased by Antec, which is nothing, but this is the procedure. One disadvantage, it does require sedation or anesthesia. We do a lot of these dogs on a reversible sedation, so people might come from a distance, you can give them an IV, do the procedure, reverse it, and send them home. But it is sedation or anesthesia. It does require a veterinarian to be certified. We go through a stringent test to make sure that we do the procedure right before they allow us to do it. The x-rays considered are 3 views. We've got one view that's just like the old hip extended OFA view. You've got 2 other x-rays we do that are more in a neutral position. Dogs don't walk around on their rear legs. These are with the dog's legs up in the air, more like in a natural weight bearing position. One's called compression and one's called distraction. The evaluations of these are all done centrally and recorded in a database. The other wonderful thing about this test is it actually compares you to your breed. So here's your hip extended x-ray. It looks just like an OFA because that's what it is. The only value for this one, for Pennhip, the only thing they use it for is to find out if these dogs have arthritis. Simple as that. But in some ways, I have a lot of breeders come to me that we do Pennhip and OFA at the same time because the problem with Pennhip is they don't do elbows. So I have some people come in, I need this x-ray for both studies. I can do my elbows and hip send them off to OFA, and then we can do Pennhip as a separate study, because I have to do 2 more x-rays with Pennhip. And here's the positioning. This is the dog on the back. And the reason we have sedation is because we want the dog, we don't want to find out how lax that joint is without the dog's muscles holding against us and fighting us. So the dog's on its back, its feet are up in the air, more like how it walks around, rather than extended. And the compression view, it used to be called compression because we actually pushed in on the hips. That's actually not required. Now the compression view, we just want to see, does that hip go all the way into that socket joint if you allow it to? That's all. That's a very simple view. Then we do the distraction position. Every Pennhip vet or technician uses these bars. And the bars have rubber on the outside, metal on the inside. We have to have 2 people do this. I have one technician hold the bar down against the pelvis. I have the legs up, and I bring the legs gently together. This does not hurt the dog. I've never had a dog sore, hurt, or anything after this procedure. But what it does is the bar is like between my elbows. And I'm going to bring the legs together, and I'm going to see how much does the hip come out of the socket. And we're judging joint laxity not on the dog's muscles, but on the innate hip laxity, even if the dog's sedated. What's holding that dog in? You can see this dog, can you see the position on the top, deep in the socket, and you see it moves out? Well, it has to move a little. You can't move your joint without a little flexibility there. So, the Pennhip measurement is something they do digitally. The compression is considered base 0, and then they do a couple quick measurements which are easy for them, all digitally, and they determine how much did that hip move out of the socket, the distance it moved, over the radius of the femur. And the reason you have to do that is because a Chihuahua's radius of the femur and distance moved is different than a St. Bernard. So we're comparing it to itself, and we come up with a percentage number. In this example, this dog's distraction index is that number we're going to call the distance it moved, is 61. In other words, this dog can luxate its hip without naturally 61% from its compression image. This dog, according to a lot of research, would have a moderate risk of developing hip dysplasia or osteoarthritis. So they do these quick calculations and they give us a number. Any questions?
At what age do you do this?
Actually, 16 weeks we can start doing it. Big advantage. This is kind of a gross picture, but Dr. Smith really left no stones unturned. He researched this till he found the maximum position and way to determine laxity. His engineering background really paid off. He also found that the hip extended view actually winds and tightens the capsule and actually pulls the hip tighter into the capsule. We actually turn the knees in a little, and that joint capsule winds and actually pushes the hip in. So this explains why we can really mask some ability of the hip to subluxate by doing the hip extended view. Don't be scared, it's not a scary slide, but it looks that way. This is breed-specific laxity, and this is one of the wonderful things about Pennhip, is that it compares your breed to your breed. But the gold standard that he used when he was studying this was the racing greyhound and racing borzoi, not necessarily the show ones, because their incidence of hip dysplasia was less than 1%. So our gold standard, can you see on the left, there's the borzoi and the greyhound at the top, and they're way off to the left. See the number 0.3? That number is gold. If your dog is less than 0.3 distraction index, in other words, it can only subluxate 30% or less when you do this test, it's never going to get hip dysplasia. I don't care if you let it run around, jumps, pound the pavement, get it hog fat when it's young. It's resistant to hip dysplasia. The dogs, as you can see, some breeds are different. For example, if you look at the golden retriever down at the bottom, it's hard to find one under 30.3, isn't it? This chart's from 2010, and we've actually seen a good bit of improvement in labs and goldens. But we can make improvements, and we'll get into that later. So the German Shepherd up at the top, the reason he had some good hips from the German Shepherd is that the researcher woman, the breeder he worked with, brought him a lot of shepherds until she got tight hips. And you can see that German Shepherd, they're fourth from the top. If you have a German Shepherd below 0.3, it is as resistant to hip dysplasia as a racing greyhound. Another number to really kind of look at is the 0.7 number. If you have 0.7 or greater, you're going to see later that those dogs will develop hip dysplasia. Wonder where collies are? Collies, the mean is 0.4. We're not horrible, we're kind of around that Great Dane. But it might scare you a little to know the tightest hip collie, the minimum is 0.18, nicely below 0.3, but the maximum is 0.86. That dog's got hip dysplasia. So then you wonder, well, how did he know that these dogs with a high distraction index would get hip dysplasia? He did years of research. he realized he wanted to have some breeding objectives to be able to make these dogs better. But look at the Cane Corso. He's studied this breed even since 2010, and basically, some of these dogs may have selected for traits and lost the tight hip genes, and that we may not be able to get them down below 0.3, but all we can do is try. The current recommendation is to breed the tightest 40 percentile in a breed. So that means below this bar, breed these guys, and you're going to tighten hips, and you'll see later you'll really move the hip tightness for any breed over. Then he did multiple studies using thousands of examples in dogs. You can see up there, German Shepherds, 677, Golden Retrievers, over 1,000, Labs. 0.3 and below is golden. Your probability of getting arthritis or hip changes, minimal to no. 0.7 or greater, you will have hip dysplasia by 2 to 3 years of age. So what about this 0.3 to 0.7? As you can see, the slope climbs pretty quickly, and that means you're at increased risk as your number increases. Some people might wonder, why are all the dead dogs together except for German Shepherds? Well, he did another study to show that they do bear weight differently. With that slanted posture, that they probably have a lot more wear and tear due to their sloped posture, which means if you're 0.3 below your German Shepherd, you're gold, but if you're in between, you probably are more likely to show arthritis than maybe some other breeds. So what do we need to know, not just veterinarians? Pennhip database has very little bias. We've got to send them all in. We sign paper that we will send them on, and I've never known a veterinarian that does Pennhip that did not send everyone in. It can be done at 16 weeks of age. The distraction index is very associated with osteoarthritis. Its heritability is much higher, 0.6. Is it perfect? No, 1 is perfect. 0.6 is considered highly heritable though. Because we have the variety of numbers, we can apply selection pressure. We can pick the best within a breed and improve a breed. And that's what selection pressure is. And it prevents early accession for osteoarthritis. Well, it's not just for breeding dogs. It's also, they've discovered that we can influence the environment in dogs at risk to minimize their development and their severity of hip dysplasia. So, tighter hips are better hips, and distraction index low is the best thing we want. So, briefly I'll go through the Pennhip report. You get this fancy report. 4 sections to it. First part, they just simply ID the dog. The second, they give you the findings. They interpret you within your breed is the third part, and then they give you recommendations, which is a relatively new thing that they've added on. So, first part, here's an example. It's a Belgian. They identify the dog on the top, and then they give you the distraction index. The right hip is 0.45, the left is 0.41. They're looking on that plain hip extended view. Do they see any arthritis? No evidence of arthritis. Cavitation is something that is noted because it means that when we did the procedure, we got a little tiny air bubble in that hip, and it messes up their readings. It doesn't hurt the dog one bit. And I think in these 20 years, I think I've had 2 cavitations. The vast majority, I just don't get it. So, this is the best part about Pennhip is it compares you to your breed. The distraction index, they're going to take the higher number from that Belgian. He was 0.41 and 0.45, and they're going to map them. See, he's the dot, 0.45. Do you see that the square is the mean? So the Belgian is somewhat loose for this breed. At this number, the dog is at mild risk for osteoarthritis. So that means it would likely be later in life and less severe. However, something to note in any breed, that this dog is relatively loose for a Belgian Malinois. So that should be considered, because we prefer to breed the tighter hip dogs, in which case you're lowering the risk. But that's one of your breeding considerations amongst many other that we have to make. So next they give you a little report, and I'm not going to sit here and read it all, but it basically explains this dog's at low risk. Here are some things, recommendations you can do if it shows symptoms. The next interpretation, this dog is a dog, it's a more dire situation. The dog was greater than 0.7, it's distraction. It's going to get hip arthritis. It's a matter of, and probably by 2 to 3 years of age. So they're making a lot of recommendations here. Basically, got to keep this dog skinny. You've got to really limit its exercise the first 18 months of its life, especially while it's growing. However, 70% or more of these dogs will lead a relatively normal life with maybe some medications. Of course, you wouldn't want to breed that one. So, rejections, oh, so rare, I just don't hear much about them. So, as far as Pennhip goes, it helps us decide some genetics. It gives us a little more information than OFA. We're a lot more than others. And part of what we try to sign up for Pennhip is that we do spread and educate everyone like you guys and other veterinarians on hip dysplasia. In a perfect world, they would love to do all litter mates. I can't say I've only had this done once. It gives you more information, probably not practical. Of course, it's going to be more expensive than your plain OFA. But the huge advantage is at 16 weeks of age, you can do this procedure. And this number is reproducible in the distraction in its entire life. So we get a lot of service dogs. We have a Fidos for Freedom group, and we do distraction index on all their dogs. But they have some breeds that maybe you can't get a 0.3 or less, but they have an educated risk because they're going to invest 2 to 3 years of training in these dogs, and we don't want to do that if they're not going to have good hips to have a full career. We do know that Pennhip is much more heritable, and you can select and improve these dogs. Estimated breeding value is something we're not going to go into today. So here is Hip Laxity listed to multiple dogs. They recommend breeding the tightest 40% of these dogs. The concern is that some of the breeds may have lost the genes for tight hips. We only know if we try. So we encourage, no matter what breed you are, to select the tightest 40%. 40 percentile. That would be your breeding objective. So far with OFA, we've had very little improvement over time past the initial help. And the Peoria lifetime study showed us a lot about how environment can influence how bad hip dysplasia is in a dog that's genetically predisposed, having a distraction index greater of 0.3. But you got to remember, if your dog is 0.3 or greater, there's a slight increased risk with the increased number. Our service dogs and all make educated decisions. We deal with a lot of Labradors and things like that, so you're not going to get many 0.3s, but they often accept a 0.4. But they wouldn't accept a 0.6 or 7. So how can we use this selection of dogs? So here's an example of some research they've done. The Borzoi, the racing Borzoi, being the golden example, less than 0.3. So we take this breed X, and we're going to breed the tightest 40 percentile of the breed. The first generation alone, you've moved it that far. We moved it, at least a percentage of dogs into the less than 0.3. So we don't know how many generations. F means how many, and N means how many generations. We don't know how long it'll take to get these dogs under 0.3. But the reality is, we can get them there. And remember, collies are at 0.4. They range up to 0.8, 6, down to 0.5. So there are collies out there at risk. You know, I think our history of collies having a little Borzoi behind them has prevented a lot. So this is very helpful for people that are either going to do performance, looking to breed a dog, and knowing what you're going to get. I've seen it reproduce itself over and over again. Somebody brings me this Borzoi, for example, it's 0.45. They bred it to a 0.4. We got everything around 0.4 in that breed, and that was pretty good for that breed. And I've seen it reproduce itself over and over again, generation after generation. So, on to some of the, will my dog get hip dysplasia? That Peoria lifetime study showed that more than 95% of labs will get it by the end of their life. But how can we prevent them from suffering? We're going to keep them lean. We're going to minimize their exercise the first 18 months, and we're going to maybe use some of these other things that we're going to show in 1 minute. You don't need those things. So here's some evidence-based, in other words, a great deal of proof had to be done for them to do this, of how we can help these dogs stay comfortable that have hip dysplasia. We can use non-steroidals like Rivendell, Deramax, and all those other drugs. Sometimes short time, sometimes long term. Remember those acute puppies that have really bad hip dysplasia when they're young, they get better and can get off the drugs. And then maybe later in life, we're going to have to start it back up. You can add drugs like amantadine to help. You're going to keep these dogs lean. I remember before Pennhip, when I graduated from vet school, one of the surgeons used to tell people with dogs with hip dysplasia that could not afford a total hip, he'd say, I want you to go home. I don't want to keep this dog so thin that the neighbors want to call the animal control on you. Because that dog will not suffer if it's lean. Now, we don't want to keep dogs thin. We want to breed dogs that don't have risk to hip dysplasia. But if you are at risk, let's keep these dogs lean. There's a lot of diet foods for the people that can't control feeding their dogs. There's also exercise, super important to keep these dogs moving without traumatizing their joints. If people wear Adequan, great evidence of proof behind Adequan injections to minimize arthritis and arthritic changes. It's considered evidence-based. And everyone heard of omega-3 fatty acids? Yeah, there's a lot of that out there. The EPA is the part of the omega-3 fatty acid which has been proven to help with dogs with arthritis. You have a lot of foods in it. You also have a lot of supplements with it in it. And acupuncture, thank goodness, finally is considered evidence-based because I've seen that work a whole lot too. What is other modalities which are still in the research phase, so I still believe many of these work quite well, are some of these other meds like gabapentin, tramadol, glucosamines, Daysequin, Cosequin, things like that. Things like laser and ultrasound therapy, cold therapeutic laser. I swear it helps a lot, but like I said, it's still considered low level of evidence. Homeopathy, chiropractor, trigger points, and regenerative medicine, which I think really works as well. So there's a lot of things we can do for these dogs. And those few dogs that suffer and can't be helped, that's where we're stuck doing surgery on them. So let's hope our collies never get there. But at 0.86, there are some. And remember, Pennhip, we can test them young. 4 months, 16 weeks. You can compare it to your breed. Make your breed improve over time. Here's the average mixed breed dog. I'm not sure what year that's done. But our goal is to get them like a greyhound, if we can get our breed. But if your dog's at risk, let's not make it suffer. Let's do some preventative modalities. Let's keep it lean, controlled exercise, and then when there is a problem, there are many therapies that can help these dogs.
How do you buy the Pennhip certified veterinarian?
That's a great question. We go to pennhip.com and look it up. And fortunately now they allow technicians to be certified as well. So but you still have to have a doctor there that's certified. But yes, you look it up there. And they're, unfortunately the cost is going to be more. Does anyone have a price that they've had to pay or heard of before?
About
$300. Yeah, I've heard the price can range anywhere from $300 to $700 for Pennhip. Right. Right, so your OFAs range probably from a couple hundred to $400 or $500, depending on where you go or where you live. And when I combine them, I totally discount it. If I'm doing hips and elbows for someone and sending to OFA and doing the Pennhip, you know, we make the fee nominally different from Pennhip, just so they get everything done at once. So, a lot of interesting science. It's the latest and best we can do for our dogs. So please use these latest tests available to us, as well as all these wonderful genetic tests that we have going.
I have a question for you. Have you ever taken a dog that had an OFA, then done a Pennhip? What was the difference?
I've had some that got very good scores on OFA and had high distraction indexes, yes. And those are the dogs that have been slipping through, and why some breeders are so frustrated. They looked good. Look at that dog, that Labrador back in the previous study. It looked great up till 8 years of age. It would have passed. But it had hip dysplasia. They just controlled the environment on that dog. So yes, we definitely have dogs that vary a lot. Any other questions? That's a great question. So basically, she asked, can you define limited exercise before 18 months? So a dog that is either showing the acute form of hip dysplasia, very painful, or for those lab breeders back in the old days, I don't recommend crating him for a year like she did. But breeders learn a lot before some vets do, you know, and they learn, you know, to feed them, to keep them lean, and limited exercise mainly means leash walks, controlled exercise. You're not going to do agility and high impact sports for the first two. But if you have a dog that has a low distraction index, his risk for hip dysplasia is nominal. We don't need to be afraid of these dogs. I still wait till their growth plates clothes before I go jumping. I'm in full height agility and all, but the fear is gone. Sure. I have some brochures. I can leave, where should I leave those Pennhip brochures?
Leave them on the back table.
We'll leave them on the back table, and then of course I'm over at the Collie Health Foundation, right behind the auction table. Right, we're doing that chick DNA banking, so anyone has dogs, that's great. So this is stuff that we don't need to do. Any more questions, guys? Yeah. She's asking at what age are they clear? And that's the beauty of Pennhip. Technically 4 months. I probably do most of mine around 6 months. You can do these dogs when they're young. It's going to tell you their risk assessment, and it will not change in their life. That's it. Yeah. So if I had a good distraction index at a 5-month-old puppy, and I'd be happy. I wouldn't be needing it for him. Yeah.
So, I know OFA has like breeders and dogs and
That's another good question. So OFA, there's a box when you guys, when you do OFA, you check off if you want to let yours be part of a public database. And for Pennhip, actually not yet, no. You kind of have to just look at people that might advertise it or not. And part of the disadvantage is right now on your AKC pedigree, they'll let you put an OFA score, but not a Pennhip. And there's probably some more politics involved there, but it'd be valuable to have that information too. Yeah.
So, if you breed 0.3 dog, and you get 0.3, do you continue to use Pennhip through the next generation, or do you stop?
Well, that's a good question because it depends. So many dogs aren't exactly 0.3. So yes, if you're diverging from dogs, you're eventually going to have to do it to compare.
If you know that you only bred dogs from the original set of parents.
You know, I would advertise that highly as these dogs' parents are 0.3, but I probably would still, if someone wanted to go do performance or something, definitely do that, you know, just to make sure. But I've seen it's so reliable, but it's not a guarantee that they're going to be 0.3 for sure. Yeah.
When I take my puppies to the vets for their health certificates at 8 weeks, he always does this like hip rotations. He takes the legs, extends them back. Is that of any real value, or does it tell you?
Well, if he's doing the Ortolani test where he's checking for laxity, or she, you're going to miss about 50% of dogs with doing that. And sometimes puppies are so wiggly, it's really hard to tell. So it doesn't hurt to do it, but it's certainly not enough information. We're good to go, guys. And if you have any more questions, please come ask me.
Do the meeting part first. First of all, everybody hear me? Okay. So what I'd like to do is thank all of you for coming. Thank you for your support, and I think we're doing some important work right now, and I see a very bright future for the Collie and the Collie Health Foundation. I want to start by introducing our officers, board, and corporators. So when I introduce you, please stand and stay standing. All right, Mary. Mary Hunter, secretary, please stand. Okay. Jerry Oliver, vice president. Where's my treasurer? Oh, Karen Anderson in the back, please stand, treasurer. And unfortunately, Krista Hansen has been working really hard as Janice restored, and she wasn't feeling well, so she is resting up for tomorrow. So thank you, officers. You may now sit down. All right, I'd like all of please stand. Minus the officers, you already said. All right, these are all our board members. I want to point out Gail Curry is membership chair, and she's done a wonderful job at her job, and everything is getting bigger and better all the time. And of course, Patty Miller is always on top of our auctions and helpful that way. So thank you all. And then may I have all of our corporators stand? If you're a corporator, please stand. Okay, so remember, these people volunteer, and once they become corporator, they agree to help and work for the foundation. So we can't do it without all of you. And thank you. I saw many new faces helping us this year, and I hope that continues. So I have a very important announcement. It's, I think, wonderful. Our very own Dr. Leanne Clark at Clemson put in a grant proposal for epilepsy research on the Collie. It's a 2-year project, $114,000, and because of all of you, we could fund it, and she is starting right away. And we do have information at our booth about it. So if you have an epileptic dog, or if you know of one, we need it banked with CHIC, but more importantly, we need it part of the study that Dr. Clark will be doing. So that's great news too. So again, I want to thank everybody for their help this week. Can't do it without your setup, cleanup, you know. All right, the total is in from Tony, Dave, and Curtis. They raised $100. All right, so this is my really favorite part of being president. We award the President's Trophy every year, which is to me an exciting award. So this year, the winner of this year's award had been indispensable to the Collie Health Foundation as long as I can remember. Always willing to pitch in, willing to help. My winner was creative about ways to help raise funds for the foundation. In the mid-90s, knowing how Collie people love to get together, this person decided to create a yearly event where people could get together, see old friends, and make new friends. There were seminars on things like grooming, handling, and even genetics. I'm going to read from our past CHF president's note that I asked her to help me give this award, Patty Merrill. It's Patty's recollection of that time and our winner that started in the church camp. Patty says, it was an inspiration for things to come. We would sit outside with our chairs pulled in a circle and talk dogs. This is where we realized our dogs had sensitivities to certain drugs. Someone would start talking about their dog's reaction, and it would end up with everyone either telling about the dog that had Imodium or their friend's dog with heart guard. We had no idea this was an eye-opener. There were questions that would lead into grants. This event was held in Birmingham for several years. It was a great success, and half the profits were given to CHF. She used her photographic talents to hold a seminar for those who came. It was a delightful time. We held the event and ate together in a main dining hall. Some slept in old motel rooms at the campground. The dogs slept in the church, and the show was held there also. It was fabulous. I called Patty when I had decided on this year's winner. I knew Patty knew more about this year's winner than even I did. As to the event Patty is referring to, it was called Getting to Know You. I was lucky enough to go there many times, and I enjoyed the ice cream socials after dinner on Saturday night. I looked forward to it every year until I left the South. My winner has helped run our silent auctions for more years than I can remember. She helped at every night auction she attended. I asked her in January to run one day of silent auctions for me. She of course said yes. The thing is, she may be on our volunteer list for just one day, but she is around every day to help. I want to finish with Patty's last paragraph because I couldn't say it any better. A few years ago, she had a long year of medical issues and forgot to send in her I agree to run card. She wasn't on the ballot, so she wasn't elected as a forwarder. Did it stop her? Heck no! She volunteered for even more time. We love you, Raylene. You love the Collie, and we work so hard to make life better for our beloved friends. Let's hear it. This year's winner is Raylene Hendricks.
I haven't done anything. I love it. That's what it's called me.
Raylene, we really do love you, and you have been a constant person in our lives for so many years. And thank you for what you do. You really deserve this. I just, again, want to thank everybody for supporting the foundation. You really make it happen, and all the volunteers who make it happen. Thanks again. We'll be back shortly.